Welcome to an introduction on the IEB. This is something that we are regularly asked about at Koa Academy as an online school that's registered with the IEB. We want to have a quick conversation touching on some of the things that come up regularly in conversations. We'll start with what is the IEB, where does it come from, and how does it fit into the broader South African education landscape. Next, we'll talk about curriculum options. This is something that parents in particular are very interested in, wanting to know the different routes that are available to them and their families in terms of exit points in particular for high school. We'll also talk about the IEB and its relationship with the Department of Education and how they essentially lead you've got two routes available to your final grade 12 exams. And we'll also unpack how CAPS fits into the picture. What exactly is CAPS and how does it relate to the IEB and the final grade 12 exams? Next, we'll talk about Koa in particular and why we chose the IEB, some of the things that we were drawn to and ended up choosing the IEB as our assessment body. And finally, I'll finish with some common questions that we're asked and maybe debunk some myths around different education options and the IEB in particular. Right, but let's start with what is the IEB. IEB stands for Independent Examinations Board, and the IEB is an assessment body. It's an organization, an independent body, which exists to be able to offer the final grade 12 exams in South Africa, your final leavers certificate. Now, some refer to that as the matric exams or the matric certificate. Others call it the NSC, which stands for National Senior Certificate. It's essentially the same thing. And there are really two routes to be able to get your final grade 12 certificate in South Africa. It's the Department of Education route and the IEB. And we'll talk about the two options a little bit later, but that's the IEB in a nutshell. It's an assessment body, an independent organization, which exists to be able to offer the final grade 12 exams in South Africa. Now, in terms of the South African educational landscape, one of the things to know is that you've really got two broad umbrellas in our South African legislation. The one umbrella is physical schools, all physical schools, whether it's public schools, private schools, international schools. They all operate under one sort of umbrella of legislation, and they report to an organization called Umalusi. And Umalusi is responsible for accrediting all physical schools in South Africa and making sure that the quality of education in those physical schools is held to a high standard. Next, you've got the umbrella of home education or homeschooling, and that follows a different set of legislation, and that is for any family whose child is learning from home and not in a physical school and is under the care of the parents. And so the parents become primarily responsible for the quality of education that the child is receiving in their own home. Now, for us in particular at Koa, we're an online school and there is no specific legislation for online schools, even though online schooling legislation is being furiously drafted at the moment, and we hope for greater regulation around online schooling in the country. At the moment, online schooling, because the child is in the parent's home, online schools fall under the umbrella of home education. And so when you are evaluating your options as families, it's important to remember that online schools operate under the umbrella of home education in South Africa. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on as well. But essentially from grade 1 to grade 9, all South African parents either need to register their child with a physical school or register directly with the Department of Education to do home education or homeschooling. And that's true for online schools, distance learning providers, or if the parent wants to take responsibility themselves for their child's education. That's up until grade 9 or the time that your child turns 16. From that point onwards, grade 10, 11, and 12, you no longer need to register directly with the Department of Education. You either carry on with a physical school or you simply sign up with a registered service provider. And I'll talk about registered service providers again towards the end when we talk about common questions. But it's important to know that in grade 10, 11, and 12, if you want to finish, particularly with a South African qualification, it needs to be through a registered service provider. And so you no longer need to register directly with the department, simply with a registered service provider for those grades. That's the South African educational landscape and where everything fits in. The IEB is able to offer grade 12 exams to physical schools as well as to distance learning providers or online schools such as Koa Academy. Let's talk about curriculum options now. Curriculum options are essentially in two broad categories for the South African families. You've got the South African curriculum, which you can follow, and then you've got international options are your two broad categories. And in international options, common ones that you've probably come across, you've got Cambridge, which is the UK qualification. Also in the UK, you've got an assessment body called Pearson Edexcel. Essentially, Cambridge and Pearson Edexcel are two different organizations that offer the same qualification, the same leaving certificate. Those are your IGCSEs, your AS levels, and your A levels. Those might be familiar to some of you. We've also got international qualifications such as the GED, which is an American qualification, and the American High School Diploma, which are two different certifications. But you've got the international options available, and then you've got the South African option. And your South African option is called the NSC, National Senior Certificate or Matric Exam. And in South Africa, you've essentially got the one leaving certificate, but you've got two different routes to be able to get there. So you've got the IEB on one hand, which is the Independent Examinations Board. And on the other hand, you've got the Department of Education, or the DBE, Department of Basic Education, the DBE route to get to your final exams. Now, one of the misconceptions quite commonly is some people have the idea that the Independent Examinations Board is for all private schools and the Department of Education route to the NSC is for all public schools, but that's actually not the case. Most private schools in South Africa currently still offer the Department of Education NSC, or the government route to the NSC, even as a private school. Some private schools do offer the IEB as their final leavers exam, and some distance learning providers and online schools use the IEB as well. So what is CAPS and how does CAPS fit into the picture? Well, CAPS stands for Curriculum Assessment Policy Statement. And the best way to think of CAPS is the underlying content. It's the curriculum that's being followed. It's what's being taught in the various subjects on offer. Now, whether you are following the IEB route or the Department of Education route to the final exams, you actually operate on the same underlying content. You're operating on the same curriculum underneath. What's different is the assessment layer. It's the approach to exams and assessing that's very different. And that obviously has a significant impact on how the content is being taught. But the underlying content is the same in South Africa, whether you're following the IEB or the Department of Education route. What's interesting to me, as I've looked at different curriculum options from around the world, really, is that the underlying content, regardless of the curriculum option, is actually very similar across all curricular offerings, particularly in subjects like the sciences and maths, where what's taught in the various curricula is very similar in terms of the actual content knowledge that's being delivered. There's obviously some subjects which are particularly contextual. We think of history, for example, or additional languages that might be on offer. What really makes a significant difference in terms of the curriculum is not necessarily the underlying content, it's the approach to how that content is being taught and ultimately how the content is assessed in exams and tests and exams. And so when it comes to CAPS, CAPS is the underlying curriculum that all South Africans must follow. So regardless of whether you're with the IEB or the Department of Education, you're following the CAPS curriculum. What's different is the approach. So when people ask me, are you CAPS or are you IEB? The answer is yes. We are a CAPS curriculum school because we're a South African school. And if you're not doing an international offering, then you are following the CAPS curriculum. What matters most is the approach to how that content is being taught and assessed. And you've probably heard a lot of people, whether it's parents or educators, talking quite negatively when CAPS comes up. And there's quite a wide feeling that CAPS is very assessment heavy, very content heavy, very memorization heavy, leads to a lot of stress in learners. I think one of the important things to note is that it's not the actual underlying content which we're talking about there. It's actually the way that the content is being taught and assessed. And so let's talk a little bit about why Koa chose the IEB in particular and what led us to pick the IEB as our assessment body. The first thing I'd want to say here is that the IEB's approach is very application-oriented as opposed to very memorization-oriented. You see, the IEB's big focus is on not just memorizing information and then being able to regurgitate it in tests, but being able to understand the information and then apply it to different contexts, evaluate, problem solve. And so the IEB's approach is what we would refer to as higher order thinking. It aligns much more with sort of how university or tertiary options approach information. The goal is not to cram a whole lot of information and memorize a whole lot of information and have very repetitive tests. It's more to be able to handle information with higher order thinking and be able to solve problems. And we really like that at Koa. We were really drawn to that. We think that it's a really relevant approach to how to deal with knowledge and information. We think that it's less stressful for learners. We think that it's more real world relevant and is reflected in real life much more. And so that's probably the biggest thing to know about the IEB and really why they came into existence. They wanted to offer an approach to the South African curriculum which was much more about those higher order thinking skills. And so they haven't changed the underlying content. The CAPS curriculum content layer is still the same. What's changed is how it's taught and how it's tested and examined. So let me give you a practical example. Let's say in a very sort of rote memorization approach, if you were dealing with a literature study and there was a short story about somebody and the question in the exam said, what was the character's intent? If you were with the Department of Education approach to the matric exams, there would probably be a specific answer to that question. And you would have memorized it, you would have learnt it, you would have practiced it, and then you would repeat it in the exam. The mark scheme for the moderators, the markers for that exam, there would be a specific answer that they're looking for, which would give you the mark for that question. Whereas the IEB's approach to something like that would be, here's a piece of writing, can you sort of unpack the character's intent? The learner would be able to give an answer and then motivate their reasoning. And their answers could vary from other learners' answers so long as they could use the text, the information that they were provided to be able to motivate accurately for their answer or demonstrate critical thinking. When you've learned those skills, those application skills, what you realize is that you can actually be asked on content that you've never seen before, and you use the same skills to be able to answer the questions in the exams. So what I've found is that if a learner is taught to memorize information and then repeat it in tests, and that's the primary focus, when they get questions in exams which they don't recognize or on content that they haven't learned, they tend to freeze up. I haven't learned this information, I don't know the answer, and so they skip it. Whereas the IEB's approach is you may not have learned this particular content, but you've probably learned the skills to be able to answer this, to be able to problem solve on this. And so learners would be much more likely to say, well, I might not recognize this, but I can probably figure out a logical way to answer this or a clever way to approach this. So it's more open-ended and higher order in that way. So that's the first one, is the application approach to teaching, learning, assessing. What that means, by the way, is greater flexibility. This is the second thing which led us to choose the IEB. When you think about being required to cover a certain amount of content, there are certain subjects that we have to cover the full content. Maths, for example, we cover all the prescribed content. But because of the approach to higher order thinking and application, there are also some subject areas which there's a greater deal of flexibility in how we go about teaching the content. For example, history. If the history curriculum has 10 topics that you have to teach a particular grade, the IEB says you don't have to teach all 10. Choose the ones that you think highlight the important skills that you want to teach in history that are important for a young person to know in history. Teach those topics, and then whichever topic comes up in the exam, whether it's one that you've taught or maybe even a different one, what's important for us is, can the learner use those higher order thinking skills? And so there's less emphasis on covering all of the prescribed content and more emphasis on covering content in a way that teaches the important skills. Also on flexibility, just to point out, the IEB has a more flexible approach to the younger grades in particular. So what we're able to do at Koa is really think about how we want to teach and assess in the younger grades. And one of our philosophies is the way that we teach and assess a grade 4 should not be the same as how we teach and assess a grade 12. They're very different age groups with very different cognitive skills, which are important. And so the way that we set up our tests and exams and assessments needs to be very different for different age groups. And the IEB recognizes this and actually gives us a fair amount of flexibility in how we go about setting up our assessment protocols, particularly in the younger grades. So flexibility was the second piece. The third for us is context. When we were evaluating different curriculum options, we obviously looked at the two South African options on offer, as well as the international options on offer. And there are some international options which were very appealing to us. For example, many people are interested in the Cambridge route. And actually, the underlying philosophies of Cambridge and IEB are in many ways similar. And so we were evaluating that as a possibility as our first choice as well. I think what one of the reasons that we landed on the IEB here is context. We really feel that it's important in South Africa for our learners to be embedded in learning which is built with their context in mind. And so their physical environment, their local environment, their communities around them need to be reflected in the body of work that they're learning and the way that they're being assessed. And so for us, doing a South African curriculum was contextually relevant and important. Next, in terms of support, this is something that is going to impact the learner, but actually is more focused on the school. And that's the fact that the IEB is very good at creating an environment of support for learners and for teachers and for schools. And so our staff are highly supported by other IEB staff in the IEB community. There's cluster groups where subject teachers get together from different schools. There's a high level of moderation that's required in terms of the type of teaching that's happening, the type of assessing that's happening, and even the way that the IEB facilitates accrediting the school. It really shows a real passion and interest for schools and service providers, and being able to give them the support that they need to thrive and offer the best that they can to their learners. And we felt that from the time we reached out to the IEB. Next up is their track record. This is something that, over the course of the 20 odd years that the IEB has been around, they've got a very good track record in terms of the quality of exams that they're setting, the way that those exams are facilitated and moderated. And in the end, what's important to us is, does this leave a certificate? Does it hold up? Is it giving the learners not just a certificate, but something that is proven after school to be valuable to the learners? And in terms of their track record, the IEB is actually very strong. One of the most significant studies for us when we were investigating opportunities, assessment bodies, was a study that was done at the University of Cape Town not too long ago, where they wanted to evaluate which curriculum option, which assessment body leads to the highest grade progression rate from year progression rate from first year to second year to third year at the university. And what they found, that statistically the IEB was significantly ahead in terms of learners progressing from year to year. And what that tells us is that the IEB's approach to assessment and thinking is more in line with tertiary options and the way that learners are required to handle information and be assessed in tertiary. Next up for us was opportunity. Obviously, we want to end with a final grade 12 certificate that opens doors, opens opportunities. The vast majority of our learners are looking for opportunities in South Africa. And so that was stop number one. Does this open doors in South Africa? And the answer with the IEB is a resounding yes. One of the things that I get asked regularly is the IEB grade 12 certificate any different to the Department of Education grade 12 certificate, like as in the physical certificate? And the answer is no, it's actually the same certificate. You see, the IEB is sort of audited by Umalusi. Now, you'll remember that Umalusi is the same organization that's responsible for maintaining a high standard of education across physical schools. And so they're doing the checks and balances in physical schools, but they also do the checks and balances for the IEB. And that's how the IEB is then licensed to be able to offer the grade 12 exams. Umalusi is then reporting directly to the Department of Education. And so when the final grade 12 exam certificates come out, when they're published the following year, it's the same certificate that has the Umalusi stamp on it to say, yes, this learner has finished grade 12 in South Africa, and therefore gets immediate recognition to all universities in South Africa, all technicons, all colleges, trade opportunities, whatever the options are after school. The IEB route is recognized immediately because it's endorsed directly by Umalusi. In terms of international opportunity, we do know that many of our families are also interested in opening international doors. And so we wanted to make sure that we were keeping those doors wide open as well. And we reached out to the IEB and said, tell us about international opportunities. And they immediately sent us a PDF. And this PDF, they publish it once a year. And it's a list of international universities that currently accept learners with the NSC, which is our final grade 12 exam. And that university list is, last time I checked early this year, the list was over 350 international universities that currently accept learners with the NSC. And the IEB is quite proactive about making sure that learners have good opportunity and that we as a school know what those international opportunities are and are able to provide those lists for our families and say, hey, here are some universities that we know recognize the NSC and have learners currently at them, students which have passed the South African NSC. And so those are immediately on offer. And then also able to investigate other opportunities. I think one of the things to point out here, if you as a parent know a particular university or a particular degree that you want your child to be able to access, your best bet is always to contact that specific university and talk to them about that specific course. There is no hard and fast rule for, does this curriculum option give me access to all opportunities like this? For example, if you wanted to go into law in South Africa, the University of Cape Town and Wits might handle their law schools very differently, and their entrance requirements might be different, even though they're actually in the same country and accept learners with the same qualifications. The same is true for international universities, and even within a university, they will handle their different schools, their different departments very differently in terms of recognition of qualifications or grade requirements. And so one of the things that I say to parents is, if you do know which route you want to go or which route is even most likely, start contacting specific universities or specific tertiary opportunities, and make sure that the opportunity that you're most interested in, you know what the requirements would be to get there, because there is no one size fits all for these sorts of things. But those are the main reasons why we chose the IEB and the things that drew us to them. Let me unpack a little bit about common questions. So let's talk about the things that are most frequently asked. The first question I've actually addressed already, which is, are you CAPS or are you IEB? And I've said the answer is yes. We are CAPS underlying content. What's important is the way that it's taught. And I think this is a distinction that's maybe more of a technicality, more about semantics. And so when a parent asks me, are you CAPS or are you IEB? If I get the sense that actually what they're asking about is the assessment layer and our approach to teaching and learning and assessing, then I'll just say we're with the IEB. But I think it's helpful for parents to start to debunk what it is about CAPS when we talk about CAPS, particularly when we have negative connotations or feelings. What is it that we feel about it that we struggle with, or that our learner has experienced negatively about it? And I do regularly draw attention to that assessment layer and the approach to teaching and assessing there. But that's the full answer to that question is yes, we are CAPS and IEB. Second question is the IEB harder? This is often a follow-on question from that. Is the IEB's approach to South African curriculum harder than the government's or the Department of Education's approach? To answer this question, I often refer to a conversation that I had with Anne Oberholzer, who was the CEO of the IEB last year. We were having a conversation and I asked her, I said to her, Anne, I often get asked by parents, is the IEB harder? What's the answer to that question? And she said to me, is it harder to run the Comrades Marathon uphill or downhill? Now, the obvious answer is it's harder to run uphill, right? But the reality is, if you've trained to run a particular direction, it's harder to go the other way. And that's true for South African options, whether you're comparing the IEB or the Department of Education route. is what have you been training for all along? That's the examination style. That's the approach to assessment that you'll be most comfortable with. And what we find in South Africa is the majority of South African learners are doing the DBE, the department approach to grade 12 exams, which is more about memorizing content. And so if you make the switch later and your majority of your high school career has been focused on memorizing bodies of content and being able to repeat the information in tests, you'll find an IEB approach very challenging. But actually, the same is true the other way around. If you were to start out in school and your approach is very much about critical thinking, analysis, evaluation, being able to support your answers, being able to problem solve using tools that you've learned, if that's your approach to education, and then you were asked to write a final exam that was very memorization heavy, you'd find that challenging as well. That would be like, if you trained to run the Comrades Marathon uphill for a whole year, but then you had to run it downhill, you'd find that very difficult. And so what's important is what are you training for, and what are you aiming for, and what skills are you learning along the way to be able to do your exit exam. I think related to that, then, the follow-on question that I often get after that is, okay, so when do I make the switch? If I am in a Department of Education approach to the grade 12 exams and I want to switch to IEB, when is that possible? And what's the latest I can do that switch? Or vice versa, if I'm in an IEB school, could I switch back to doing a Department of Education approach? Switching between curriculum options, and when should that happen, and how should I think about that? And then finally, what are the minimum requirements? Let me start with the minimum requirements, because this is important to know. If you're going to join a registered service provider for grade 10, 11, or 12, you have to have a grade 9 pass. So it's a South African requirement by law that every learner gets to the end of grade 9 and writes exams at the end of grade 9 to show that they've passed grade 9. Now, you can do that as a homeschooler, or you could do it through a school or an online school or something like that. Let's say you've done homeschooling and you've had an eclectic approach and you've leveraged various different curriculum options for different subject areas, and you now want to get to the end of grade 9 and get access to grade 10, 11, and 12 through the IEB. What you would then need to do is at the end of grade 9, you would need to sit exams or tests that show that you've reached the standard required for grade 9 South African learners. And you can do that through various ways. There are several organizations or schools who would let you sit those tests. You could even do it yourself and bring somebody in who's experienced and an objective tutor or teacher to come and sit those exams or tests with your child. But you then take those results, those tests, and as long as the child has passed according to the minimum requirements for grade 9, that would then give you access to grade 10 options through registered service providers. If you'd like to know more about what those minimum requirements are and which subjects need to be written, you're welcome to reach out to me. I'd happily walk you through that. The other thing I'd say, if you are a homeschooling family and you're wanting to make sure that you've got access to grade 10, 11, and 12, something that's important for schools like us is we really want to see some sort of portfolio of evidence, some sort of, this is what we've been working on. So keep track of, these are the curriculum options that I've leveraged. Here are some samples of their writing or assessments that we've done along the way, or anything like that is really helpful for us to be able to evaluate the level of the learner and make sure that they're going into grade 10 well equipped and well prepared. You can even make the switch after grade 10. So we do, I was talking earlier about running uphill, running downhill. We do still accept learners who were with the Department of Education route or with Cambridge right up until, grade 10, even grade 11 will take learners on. In fact, beginning of this year, we accepted a learner into grade 12, which is fairly rare for a learner to make a switch in grade 12. And certain things have to line up. So, for example, their subject offering had to match ours. Their grades had to be good. And the older they get, the closer they get towards grade 12, the more emphasis we put on coming from another IEB school. But even if a learner applies to us in grade 11 from a Department of Education route, we would still have a look at their subject offering and have a look at their grades to see whether we think that a switch across to us, even at that late stage, would work out. So it's always best to contact the school or the service provider that you're interested in and say, this is our context, this is where we are at the moment. Or what do you think about making a switch? How would that be possible? And when would the timing be best? It's also possible to switch to other options such as, Cambridge or the American GED. What I typically say to families on that is if you know that you want your exit point to be, let's say, Cambridge, then it's wise to start making that switch around about grade 9 is typical best practice. Going from the IEB to Cambridge is easier because of the higher order thinking, because of the approach to analysis and evaluation, than switching from the Department of Education route to Cambridge at a later stage. There you'd probably want to switch across at around grade 8. But it is possible to move between those. Once you've started your preparations for your O-levels, for your IGCSEs or your A-levels, though, you kind of want to be locked into that curriculum and have made your choice that that's going to be your exit point at that point. But up until around grade 9, you've got quite a bit of flexibility around that. One of the things I say to parents often is, which is better? Is the IEB's approach or is the Department of Education's approach better? I've explained some of the reasons why as a school body we stood back and we said this is why we're going with the IEB as our first offering. But actually we would like ultimately to be able to offer both routes. And the reason for that is different learners are different and there's no one size fits all in education. This is something I say often to parents is I'm excited that there are more options for families in South Africa than there've ever been before in terms of how you educate your child. I think what's important is for you to evaluate your child and ask, which environment do I think they would thrive in? And for some families, that's sort of the IEB route. For some learners, it might be the Department of Education route. For some learners, it might be an international curricula. For some learners, it might be a different type of schooling system entirely. And so you've really got to be able to evaluate each child. And it's not even the case that, one option fits a whole family. I often reference a family that we've got here at Koa. They're based here in Cape Town, and they've got 4 children. And all 4 kids are in 4 completely different types of schooling. Not even 4 different schools, different types of schooling. One is with us at an online school. One is sort of doing distance learning provider route at home where they receive a boxed curriculum and they work through the material independently. One is being taught by the parent using an eclectic approach. And one is in a physical school, in a traditional physical school. And they've done that intentionally because they know each of their kids and they've evaluated which type of system, which type of curriculum, which type of learning is going to suit them best. And they've pulled on those levers for each one. And I really respect that. What's challenging is firstly knowing what the options are, and then secondly being able to evaluate the differences between them and being able to know which one's going to suit your child the most. And so this for me is a really critical part of my job as a principal is helping families to find options for their kids which make most sense for them, for the individual. It's something that is really exciting for families, but at the same time quite daunting and quite challenging. Okay, let's move on to the next question, which is the IEB internationally recognized? I think I've touched on that already, and I'd be happy to send that list to anybody who's interested that the IEB publishes every year with a list of universities which recognize the South African NSC. Next question is, how do I know if a school is IEB registered? It's a really important question, particularly if you're interested in doing the IEB exit route for grade 12. And let's say you've done homeschooling for your journey from grade 1 to grade 9. You might have used a service provider. You might have taught your child yourself. You might be using an eclectic approach. Some families do unschooling in South Africa. Whatever the case is for what you've done up until grade 9, what's really important for grade 10, 11, and 12 is to know that if you want to do grade 12 exit exams in South Africa, you must be with a registered service provider for grade 10, 11, and 12. And so knowing that the option that you're going with, whether you decide to plug into an online school, boxed curriculum, distance learning provider, or you decide to send your child to a physical school for grade 10, 11, 12, it must be with a registered service provider. And the best way to know whether they're registered is to contact the assessment body directly. So if you want to know if they're with the IEB, go onto the IEB website. Really simple, just Google IEB. They'll pop up, go onto their website, and they've actually got a list of all IEB registered service providers and schools in South Africa. If they're not on that list, they're not with the IEB. The alternative option to that might be a physical school who are registered directly with the Department of Education, or it might be another online school or service provider that's using a body called Sakai. That's SACAI. Sakai is an organization which is licensed to be able to offer the Department of Education NSC to online schools and distance learning providers. So online schools and distance learning providers that aren't doing IEB are probably registered with Sakai. And so if you see we're Sakai registered, then you can pop onto the Sakai website or contact Sakai and confirm, is this organization or this body registered with you? And Sakai is licensed to be able to offer the Department of Education NSC at the end. But that's the best way to know if a school is or a service provider is registered. Next up, what subjects does the IEB offer? The IEB, because it's built on the same underlying content, the IEB offers the same range of subject offerings as the Department of Education or physical schools. And so you'd recognize most of those. At Koa, we do English home language, first additional language. You do either Afrikaans or isiZulu with us. It's a requirement in South Africa to do an additional language that's South African. You also do either maths or maths literacy are your two options there, life orientation. And then we've got a range of electives, subjects like geography, history, physical science, life science, business studies. And you choose from 3 of those, and you end up doing 7 subjects for grade 10, 11, and 12, and you write your 7 subjects at the end of grade 12, and that's how you get your leaving certificate. Next up, where do I write IEB exams? Very good question. Thanks for asking. You write IEB exams at either a center or a school that's registered as an IEB exam center. So it does not have to be a school. It could be an independent organization that's registered with the IEB to be able to host exams there. And they're dotted around all over the country. So what we do is we look at each family and we see what area they're in, and we direct them to either a school or a center that's close to them, and you can go and write there. The way the IEB handles families who've been doing homeschooling or are with distance learning providers or online schools is if you were to register, let's say you register with Koa, you would then become a Koa candidate, but you could write in any center or school around the country. And Koa is responsible for helping you to team up with that school or center. So we say these are the ones that are available. We communicate with the school or the center, make sure that they're willing to accommodate you. Your child then goes to that school, and then the school gets sent the exam papers from the IEB in 2 packs. The one will say, here are all of the exam papers for the kids from the school. Here are all of the exam papers for kids from Koa or other service providers. And then you write the same exams, and then the school will put those all back together and send them to the IEB. But end of the day, the IEB knows which exams were written by learners from different service providers or schools, even if they were at the same center. All right, next up, how can I do IEB on my own? This is kind of related to the registered service provider thing. You cannot do the IEB exams on your own. This is one of the differences between the IEB and an option like, for example, Cambridge. With Cambridge, you don't have to do a service provider for multiple years. You just register to write the final exams, and then it's up to you to make sure that your child is getting the correct instruction and the right learning, and is with somebody who's experienced in training learners for those final exams. With the IEB, you cannot just register as an independent to write the final grade 12 exams. It has to be through a registered service provider. You can still do it as a homeschooler. That's a different question. Can you do it as a homeschooler? The answer is yes, absolutely. There are several distance learning providers and online schools which are registered with the IEB for you to be able to write as a homeschooler, but you can't register directly for the final IEB exams. It has to be through the service provider. Okay, and that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I think I've touched on all of the main themes. Just to reiterate, every family is unique. Every individual learner is unique. And so the best thing for you to be doing is have an idea of where you'd like to end up and then engage with people. Engage with schools, engage with service providers, engage with individuals in your area. There are homeschooling communities who've got some wonderful people who are incredibly experienced in helping families to access opportunities which might be a good fit for them. There is no one size fits all. And so having those people that you trust to be able to lean on and get support and guidance is really important. And then engaging in conversations and doing the groundwork of looking into those options and asking questions about your particular context. One of the things I say to parents often is engage with, if you're looking at a school or a service provider, engage with them and ask them questions about your specific context. A school or a service provider should always want to know about your particular situation to be able to give you best practice or best advice. That's really important because everybody's unique. You're very welcome to reach out to me if you'd like to ask any questions either about Koa or about the IEB in particular. If you want to pop onto either our website or the IEB's website, we'll put those on the screen now, but we'll also put them in the description below. And you're welcome to go and visit us there. But we wish you all the best as you look to leverage the best opportunities for your family.